Good morning, everyone. Good morning. I want to thank you all for joining us this morning for our next edition of our Java with Joe series. We do these every fourth Thursday of the month, except for November and December, because it's always Thanksgiving and Christmas. So I figured you guys want to be somewhere else than here, because I know I would. We're very happy to have back Dr. Michael Eula, our county historian, who is going to be sharing parts of his newest book, Hidden History of Genesee County. And we do have copies of both of his books, so if you'd like one, you can come up. I'm sure he'll be happy to put his John Hancock on it for you, a piece of collectible memorabilia from Genesee County history. But Michael, take it away.
Thank you.
All right.
Good morning. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you.
First of all, I want to thank everyone for being here. When I was offered this position now almost 12 years ago, some of you may remember Jay Giselle. He called me on the phone and said, yeah, we'd like to hire you. I hadn't expected to be working full-time anymore after retiring as a history professor after many years. But I have to say it's been an extraordinary experience here, as evidenced by the turnout this morning. None of you actually have to be here, unlike students. You're here because you're really interested. That has been a source of constant joy and satisfaction for me. If you've read any of these last two books, I hope you've enjoyed them. And as I speak this morning, I don't want to keep it formal. Feel free to interrupt, disagree, challenge. I really think that's important to create a good environment. Before we start, I want to introduce, some of you may remember Judy Stiles, our previous history research assistant. She retired after many years, and we've been fortunate enough to hire a new history research assistant. If I could embarrass her to stand up for a moment. Amy Buck, who comes to us highly regarded. She's a summa cum laude history graduate of the University at Buffalo, and she has gotten off to a great start. I have great hopes for her as the years go on. She has her own research projects, and she does a really good job administratively in the history office. So make sure you come by and say hello to her, and she's there to answer questions, anything that you have. All right, what I want to do is start out, actually, this book started out as one big book, both of these books. And I had a contract with SUNY Press, and after 3 rewrites, it was agreed by the editor there, Richard Carlin, and myself, that it'd be best if I took my work elsewhere. And so I did, and I have to tell you, that was a fairly challenging experience, because after having the rewrites, and originally the book was over 400 pages, one of the differences I had with them was that they wanted me to shorten it considerably. I said no. We did shorten it somewhat, but publishing costs being what they are, and editorial realities being what they are, I just thought it best to go elsewhere. So I happened upon the history press for this book. So this book basically is half of what would have been an entire book on Genesee County. And then this is much of what would have been the second half. It's not everything. There are some things that never did make it into the books. But I'm hoping again that people have enjoyed what I have done. When I first took the job, I noticed that there were a number of local histories, Ruth McAvoy and others, and they did a great job of giving factual narratives of our local area. But where I had disagreements, scholarly disagreements, was I didn't see really any interpretation. They would tell you when a building was built, they would tell you who was mayor in a certain year, and all that stuff's important, obviously. But if we don't go beyond that, we're leaving out a big part of what history is. And a big part of history is interpretation. And those interpretations, contrary to what some people believe, change radically over time. They change for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is that historians, like everyone in this room, are coming out of a the present reality that they find themselves in. So I don't think it's an accident, for example, that a lot of the what's now called radical history of the United States really took off in the 1960s and early to mid 1970s at a time of great upheaval in American society. The Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement, the Women's Rights Movement, the modern one, and a whole bunch of other things. So I thought it would be important to give an interpretive feel to the histories that have been done here, and that's what I attempted to do in both of these books. When I started to think about that seriously, I thought, well, I only have so much time because I'm also pulled in other directions. As the county historian, I'm also the records management officer, which affords no opportunity to actually research and write history. But in the time I had, and with regard to the resources that we had, I felt that this interpretive framework needed to be done, and that's what I did. And it was, at times, I grimace when I look at my own writing because I could see where I stopped, and I didn't work on it for 2 days, and then I went back for a day, and then I went back for an hour, and then I took much of it home, or came in on weekends so I could work uninterrupted on it. And eventually, both of these books took, with the research and writing, about 4.5 to 5 years to research and write. And I hope that it's a contribution to the local historiography. When I started to conceptualize the project, I thought, well, how should I approach this? And what I immediately thought of is something that historians call the Annales School of Historical Writing. That's ANNALES. And if you Google that, you'll see that actually began in France in 1929. A group of French historians began to write about people who hadn't been written about much in history. Rather than simply looking at political elites or powerful, say, corporate heads, that sort of thing, they started looking at ordinary life. And they started to look at ordinary life, as one of the historians there, Fernand Braudel, put it, in terms of the long view. They had a French phrase for this, basically meaning that there looks like a locked surface continuity, but underneath things are always bubbling up, and there's constant conflict and chaos, and people are questioning and re-questioning all sorts of things in their everyday lives. So that's what gave me the start conceptually. And in the first book, I had some people ask me when it first came out, how come you started a book with a treatment of the 1960s in Genesee County? And I did that because, as I tried to stress in the introduction, here's some water. As I tried to stress in the introduction, this was going to be a thematic approach. Yes, years are important, knowing when something happened and that sort of thing. But what's really important is how people were thinking about all sorts of things. And that's what the Annales historians focused on. They called them the mental states, basically, of historical actors. So I thought it would be fitting to start a history of Genesee County with 3 major national events that clearly brought enormous amounts of discussion into the public arena here in the 1960s. And that was, of course, the 3 assassinations that decade of JFK, Martin Luther King, and Robert Kennedy. I tried to capture what those mental states were and tried to go beyond simply what the Daily News said about it, although that was extremely important, but also from other sources, which brings me to another point. In both books, I was, as much as anything else, not only restricted by time, I was restricted by the sources themselves. Sometimes people forget that, because I've had questions, well, why didn't you talk about this, or why didn't you talk about that? Well, it wasn't just time. To do that, what they were asking about properly, I would have to go to archives outside our area. Well, that takes money, along with time. And that means going to archives, sometimes in other countries, if you're going to do something properly. So the topics I did choose for this thematic approach were topics as much as anything else based upon the sources we have in our county archives. And I have to say, coming out of academia, this is really, and I'm not just saying this because I work here, it really is the best local archives I've ever seen. I have not seen in any other place such extensive local archives. I taught for many years in California, and for all of its so-called progressivism, as they like to say, there is no mandatory public historian there. They have one state historian and that's it. So where would you find local sources? Stuffed into people's closets, their attics, their cellars. That's assuming you even can get access to it. But New York is very different. The fact that we mandate here public historians right down to the village level is pretty unique. And one of the results of that is that we have very good archives. Some better organized than others, but they're there. And they're there for the public to use. They're there for historians to use undertaking projects like this. So in that first chapter, looking at the 1960s, I then jumped from that, and I'll get to this in a minute, into the Cold War. And well, how are you going to handle the Cold War in Genesee County? Well, you handle it by looking at things like that hospital drill that took place at the VA hospital here in 1956. And it raised all kinds of issues. When you start to look at the sources, it raised issues about what people believed, sometimes mistakenly, about what a nuclear war would be if one actually happened here in Batavia. And it was pretty, frankly, amusing to look at moments when they're having this drill and they talk about fire engines and ambulances getting to the hospital and getting to neighborhoods and bringing people in for treatment. They're assuming there are even ambulances and hospitals around after a first nuclear strike. So there was something else going on there, which I talked about, and of course that was basically a denial of what a nuclear war would actually entail. And it always makes me shudder in our own day when I hear leaders pick your country who talk so glibly about launching nuclear attacks, not really, I don't think, grasping or just not caring, which I think is even worse, about what the effects would be on the general population. It's not like a conventional war. It's not simply the destruction of a building, that's bad enough. But it leaves all kinds of traces, radioactive and otherwise. I mean, even in the 1950s, they didn't talk about it here in Batavia. There were studies done by the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission, which pointed out that any of the land that was there within striking distance of a nuclear weapon would be unusable for at least 90 years because of the radioactivity. So how Batavia, how Genesee County handled nuclear war tells us a lot about a lot of other things, rather than simply saying there was this drill in 1956. The third topic I looked at in here, I really shifted the emphasis, and I talked about immigrants to our county and what happened to subsequent generations. I focused in particular on two large immigrant groups here, the Irish arriving in the first half of the 19th century, and then the Italian immigration that arrived largely in the second half and the first decades or two of the 20th century. What was their reception? What kind of work did they do? What attracted them to Genesee County? How did this contribute to an understanding of what it meant to be foreign, whether it was 1920 or 1840 here in Genesee County? And that, of course, led eventually to a chapter on the Ku Klux Klan. And I was surprised when I started to work on that part of the book, when people would come into the office and ask me what I'm working on, and I told them, is it the Ku Klux Klan that was in Genesee County? I said, yes. It was actually quite predominant in the early 1920s. About what we could see from the records, about 3,600 dues-paying members of the Klan. And I thought, as I was going through that, well, what is it exactly that they were agitated about? Because the black population here was minimal. So what was it? Well, they were going after other targets as they saw it, Roman Catholics in particular. So that meant by definition Irish and Italian, who the majority, not all, majority were Roman Catholic. They went after people that they saw as smuggling a bootleg liquor into Genesee County. There were a lot of people in Genesee County in the early 1920s who belonged to the Prohibition movement in one way or another. And they equated actually foreignness with drunkenness and foreignness with criminal elements smuggling liquor into the county. So I went into some detail about all that. I then looked at, again, notice there's no chronology here. I looked at, well, how did the New Deal here look? The New Deal, of course, of FDR. And it was pretty amazing. I wasn't totally surprised, but in the 1932, the 1936, and the 1940 elections, Roosevelt, especially in 1936, had landslides around the country. People, not all certainly, but many, the majority, welcomed the New Deal for all kinds of very substantive, concrete reasons. It was improving their lives at a time of enormous economic dislocation here and around the world. And yet, Genesee County in those three elections voted Republican, by and large. In 1932, Herbert Hoover won in this county. In 1936, Alf Landon in this county beat Roosevelt, and this was the only county in New York State that Roosevelt lost that year in the election. And then in 1940, despite Wendell Willkie, I have some pictures of that, coming through here on the back of trains and getting large crowds, he too won. Roosevelt did not win in Genesee County. And again, I was wondering, what are the reasons for this? And the reasons were pretty straightforward, especially with Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover represented many of the values that people held dear here in the county in 1932. He was a farm boy from Iowa. He was someone who had been completely self-made, it must be said. He was orphaned at the age of 10. He grew up out in California with relatives. He worked his way through Stanford, obtaining an engineering degree. He was in the first graduating class of Stanford in 1891. And that was all, and many other things, played up in newspapers like the Daily News. Basically, even though Hoover's not from Genesee County, he's one of us. We could trust him. FDR, on the other hand, was a governor of New York. He comes from a wealthy family. He's not really one of us, and he's going to promise you all these things, and then he's going to raise your tax levels through the ceiling to fund this New Deal. So looking at the New Deal, Roosevelt, Hoover, again, opened up a lot of avenues for interpretation in Genesee County history. And then finally, I shifted gears radically in that last chapter, and I looked at women in Genesee County, but I restricted it to basically middle-class women. Women whose families owned property, women who enjoyed positions of status in the community, and what was their experience? What was interesting with that was the numbers of Genesee County women who are called privileged, who were vehemently anti-female suffrage. They did not want women to have the vote. There was a debate held here in Batavia in the early 20th century, I don't recall the year offhand, but it was advertised for several weeks in the Daily News. It was around 1905 or so. And it was a debate between women in the county who supported extending the right to vote to women, and women who opposed this. And what really came out in the articles and eventually the debate, as at least it was covered, was that the women who opposed this were already married to very prominent local attorneys and local businessmen who felt threatened by women who weren't in that domestic situation and didn't want them to have a voice. So when we think that, well, automatically, of course, all women would support the right to vote, we have to be careful. about these historical generalizations, because you start to look at local areas like this, and you start to see that generalization doesn't apply. All right, so what I did then in the second book was the History Press thought I had really said enough about Genesee County in this first one, so I again had to look for another publisher, and I actually didn't have to keep looking because they found me. A little press that publishes mostly literature up in Buffalo, NFB Press. They're just starting their non-fiction line of books. So the editor contacted me and he said, did you have anything else on Genesee County? I said, yeah, actually I have half of a book that's not published, a little more if you like it. He said, well, send it along and we'll see. And about a week later they got back to me and said, yeah, we'd like to publish it. And a few changes here and there, but nothing major. So Historic Chronicles became the hidden history. So it's basically the same thing, except I look at very different topics. And I looked at topics that weren't really explored in those local factual narratives, or they weren't explored, again, from the point of view of having interpretation. Yes?
I could not understand the initials. What do they stand for? Is it owner-owned?
It's a corporate-owned NFB. It's
I couldn't understand those initials.
yes, NFB. I'm trying to remember what it stands for.
But it's not family names.
No, it's not family names. And they're up in the city of Buffalo. I'm trying to remember what NFB stands for. I don't remember.
That's okay. I'll look it up.
Yeah, if you Google it, you'll find it. But they were great to work with, and they just let me go with 6 more chapters. And that's what you see in that book. And again, what I did was, again, it's the same thematic approach. I eschewed the chronology unless it was necessary at some moments. But I certainly didn't organize the book in that way. And I, again, wanted to look at topics that hadn't been dealt with in the local historiography or that had been dealt with differently. So, for example, chapter 1, as I'm sure everyone here is familiar with Emory Upton. There's been a lot written about Emory Upton. And Emory Upton, of course, has also been written about extensively by non-local historians, if you look at that literature. What I wanted to do was to look at different aspects of Emory Upton. And we had some of those aspects in our library. So, for example, one of the things I did in that chapter, which I entitled Emory Upton and the Formation of Modern America, basically connecting once again what's happening here to national developments. Well, he's coming of age during the apex of Victorian culture. And he has a brief 2-year marriage, some of you I'm sure are aware, to Emily Martin. And she unfortunately passes away after less than 2 years of marriage. But looking at their correspondence, looking at what she said to him before they were married, looking at what he said to her before and then after they were married, reveals quite a bit about the formation of middle-class life, husband and wife, marriage, family, that sort of thing in mid to late 19th century America. She was concerned when he was still, of course, he was a career Army officer, so he stayed in the Army after the Civil War. She was concerned that he wasn't attending church services enough. She was concerned about all sorts of things regarding his moral life. And she did not accept his explanation, well, I don't generally go to services out here, the fort he was in Kentucky, because a lot of my fellow soldiers, they have mild religious ideas and the Bible and all that, but they're not really serious about it. These guys like to drink and play cards when they're not training for the next battle or hunting down Native Americans. I don't really feel like it's sincere to go to church with them. But she didn't accept that. And you start to look at those letters, and what you see is the Victorian idea of what the ideal woman should be, what the ideal wife and the ideal mother should be. She should basically, yes, he's the head of the family vis-a-vis the rest of society, but she's really at the center of the family. She's the moral center. there. And then maybe I went too far because I had some people critique me for this. I said in that way, Emily actually looked like she occupied a superior position to Emery. Because even though Emery's out there and he's earning a paycheck and he's an Army officer and he makes general eventually and all the rest of it, she is the one who really calls the shots. And she is the one who really determines what the relationship looks like. On the level of morality and sexuality, the women actually occupied a superior role. The men were basically hopeless, morally and in terms of their sexual drive. But women had self-discipline. Women could keep that wild male under control. And that really came out in some of her letters to Emery. So looking at that private correspondence, and we were fortunate, we received a donation valued at about $10,000. I have that locked away in our archives. The letters of Emery Upton, and I used some of those for that chapter. Those were donated to our department. I have to say proudly, that's the type of donation that usually goes to a large research university, but people down in Georgia who submitted that, there's a story about how they came into possession of the letters, they chose us. And they sent along the valuation from an appraiser, and that's where I come up with the $10,000 figure.
I'm sorry, I missed out on how the 10,000 was acquired and what year did this all transpire?
This happened a few years ago. I have to look at my records. We have the letters locked away. I don't even keep those out in the archives because...
10 years?
Oh, no, it wasn't that long. I would say about 5 or 6 years ago. The Daily News and the Batavian, I'm sure if you Google it, they ran articles about it when we received them, and it was a big deal at the time. And I really made a point of letting people know that this was not the typical contribution to a local historical archive. This is the sort of thing that goes to a large research university, and yet they thought enough of us to donate it to us.
The $10,000
was
was from the people who
No,
contributed?
it was his letters, and the letters of Emery Upton, many of them, actually all of them in this collection. The people who donated it sent along with the letters a letter of appraisal from an appraiser down in Atlanta, who said these are valued at that time at about $10,000.
Oh, it's the value. It
It's
didn't
the
have
value,
anything
right.
to do with separate
Which is
ones.
why I keep them locked away.
I see.
I'll show you.
Okay.
Yeah, they're in that back room in the back. But yeah, I didn't feel comfortable leaving those out and about because they're just that rare. In any event, in that second book, obviously, second chapter rather, a lot has been written about the Civil War here in Genesee County, but again, I tried to stress aspects of the Civil War that weren't dealt with in the local historiography. So I essentially approached it not in terms of battles and all that. You could read that in a million volumes out there. I approached it from the perspective of what historians call intellectual history, the history of ideas. So how was the idea of freedom here in the county, how did it manifest itself during the Civil War? Because the war, as much as anything else, was a battle of ideas, not just about slavery, but also about how society should be organized, slavery and otherwise.
So we prefer the Union?
I'm sorry?
So when we prefer the Union?
I didn't
The
understand.
Union. Weren't we part of the Union?
We were part of the Union, yes, although there is a Confederate soldier buried at one of our cemeteries here in the county. That's another aspect, if you bring it up. There were families here that were forever separated because when the war broke out in 1861, you had some relatives who absolutely could not join the Union Army fast enough and supported the efforts of President Lincoln to reunite the country. There were other relatives in that same family, and there were many fights about this. It comes up in the sources who said, no, the Confederacy has a point. Really, we don't care about slavery. What we care about is states' rights. Local areas have the right to decide their own futures. So I'm gonna run off and I'm gonna join the Confederate Army and fight for them. And obviously, in those families, the differences became irreconcilable by the time the war ended, assuming those people were still alive.
Did you uncover about the Confederate soldiers' location, or did you just research, or how did
I
you
did some-
browse? Did you browse it like at the cemetery?
I knew someone would ask me that when I said it. I don't recall which cemetery it is. I know for certain.
For your
I
next time.
think, yeah, I think it may be Alabama, but I'm not positive. It's going in that direction.
Mike, I believe he's talking about Mr. Tracy, Major Tracy. He's in the historic cemetery on Harvest Avenue.
Oh,
The Confederate soldier?
Yeah, the Confederate soldier.
Oh, okay. So
Yeah.
as you answered that, because I know you know. Okay. The other thing in that chapter that came up was there were people here who defined freedom as the freedom of every single individual human being to determine their own fate. And by definition, that meant you oppose slavery. There were others, however, in Genesee County, just like in general in the South, who saw freedom in a very different way. The enslavement of another human being they started with, just like in the Confederacy, is something that is built into human history. I mean, we may not want to be the ones to be slaves and bought and sold and all that, but the reality is that Romans had slaves, ancient Athenians had slaves, all kinds of people around the world had slaves, and they wrote books about this, defending Southern slavery in the South. There were some in Genesee County who accepted that argument, that the freedom was it gave those who weren't slaves the freedom to progress and develop everything from technology to more sophisticated political systems, because you had other people over there doing all that grubby work that needs to get done if you're going to have this thing called society. So yes, it's freedom, but it's freedom for a smaller number of people. And the local area, whether it's Mississippi or Genesee County, they argue, should have the opportunity to decide that for themselves. So looking at the Civil War in terms of the history of ideas, what did freedom mean? That raised a lot of other questions, like I'm suggesting. It also raised another question for those who were opposed to slavery. Well, if we're opposed to slavery because it is a curtailment of individual rights, then how can we deny women full and equal voting rights? How can we deny them full and equal rights, period? Because if we do that, basically we've enslaved them here. And there was, of course, the Seneca Falls Convention held in 1848, and there was a petition, which we have in our archives, on the part of the women of Genesee and Wyoming, who argued that there needed to be, since we're talking about ending slavery for what they called Negroes, we should also end slavery of any kind of oppression of our women here in Genesee County, and while around it, New York State and the United States as a whole. So to talk about freedom led to many other discussions about all sorts of things. It also led to discussions, well, what should the role of the federal government be? There were those here in the county who argued the federal government, rather than being oppressive, is actually able to liberate people. It's liberating slaves in the Confederacy. It could liberate people here in terms of their poor working conditions and all sorts of issues that come up. The federal government needs to be expanded. The federal government that was expanding during the Civil War needs to be made a permanently large federal government. Now, you don't usually equate that with thinking in a very conservative Genesee County, but there were people here who were arguing that during the Civil War. Others, of course, who argued just the opposite. We need more local rule. Even the state government gets oppressive. We need to run our affairs here in the county and on the town and village level. We don't need the federal government snooping around telling us what to do, because they don't really know us as well as we know ourselves. Those kinds of issues, which we think about as contemporary issues, they're really just bursting onto the scene, at least here in the county, prompted by the Civil War. in the mid-19th century. All right, before we go on, does anyone have any comments or questions?
I have a question about the letters.
Yes.
I'm sure all of us have a box of letters somewhere. Can you tell us, like, how do we know what we should save? Do I have a box of letters worth $10,000, and if so, who's going to pay me for them?
Well, if anybody writing those letters is famous, you may want to reconsider getting rid of them. But that's a purely subjective individual decision. I really can't offer a blanket opinion on that. My guess as a historian, because we confront this all the time in the history department, to accept this donation, do we not accept this? I like to err on the side of caution and accept we don't know down the road how useful these will be. There are a lot of family letters that can tell you quite a bit about all sorts of things. You know, your immigrant ancestors. It can tell you about what the conditions were that they found themselves in. I've had more occurrences over the years than not where people will come in to do a genealogy and they're upset because they found out, well, wait a second, Grandma didn't tell me she was divorced. I didn't know people could get divorced back then. Grandpa didn't tell me he had a wife in another town, and the current wife was upset about this. This came out in Grandma's letter. I just remember Grandpa, he was a sweet old man. I can't imagine him doing something like that. So those letters reveal they reveal a lot of reality. I mean, one of the things that used to upset, in my experience, the years I taught students, was they came in with preconceived, not all of them, but a lot of the undergraduates, they came in with preconceived notions about what they thought was true. And then I'm standing there talking about something in the book, and my 7th grade teacher never told me that, with this very accusatory tone. I said, well, I don't know what to say about that, except to say that the evidence is there for whatever. And I used to say, well, you know, history is not intended to be therapy. It's not necessarily there to make you feel good. I have to tell you, many times at the end of the day, throughout my career, I thought, man, this stuff is grim. I need to go watch a Mets baseball game. I just need to get my mind off this stuff because it's really depressing if you just keep at it. But then you come back to the idea, well, I think it'd be more depressing if we didn't know what really happened, and because it enables us to understand what's happening now. You know, we hear so much in our own day about this politician, that politician. So part of me, I shrugged my shoulders. What else is there? They were screaming about corruption in Congress before the Civil War. I mean, people attacked in Congress. People attacked each other physically. This is not new. I'm not saying I like it, but what I am saying is I don't get overly excited about it because it's sort of part of life, you know. So you don't know what you're going to find in those letters. And you may look at those letters today and then look at them 20 years from now when your life looks different and see very different things.
Sure.
Because the past always changes.
Okay, I'm going to follow up with one thing. How do we save letters? I used to save letters and throw the envelopes away. Now I think, oh no, there's actually the stamps on the envelope, the return addresses on the envelope. I'm one of these people who's lived in enough places, I can't even tell you some of the addresses I've lived at.
I tend to keep everything, including the envelopes, which themselves are repositories of evidence.
Okay, thank you. I don't want to derail you, but it's such a fascinating
It's not
topic.
really, no. So I wanted to do.
So your family,
I'm sorry?
one thing, I would say, things aren't limited just to letters.
No.
We purchased a house in 1988 at auction, and the prior owners had collected a lot of stuff, including slides of big events in the city of Batavia, the opening of the Thruway Exchange, a huge flood where East Avenue and Main Street were all covered in water, and we donated those things to the history department. I don't know if they'll ever use them, but bottom line is, if you wanted to see the dignitaries at the opening of the Thruway Exchange,
Yes.
it's there. So it's not just limited to letters.
No, and you're absolutely right. Any kind of what the stories called material culture, which is anything that's not written, is of potential use to people. And you don't have to be writing a history book. I mean, you could be researching your family's history. You just may be interested. And so these sources are of great value. But yeah, physical objects all kinds of things make up what we call the past, make up what we really should call life. It's just like an earlier moment.
My favorite quote from Harry Truman: "There is nothing new in the world except the history you do not know."
Yeah, Harry Truman was, yeah, that's another issue. Harry Truman was actually, he was a great example of how you use history to make decisions as a policymaker. If you read his memoirs, they're fascinating, 2 volumes. And Truman talks about how he was constantly, when he was confronted with all sorts of contemporary issues, suddenly thrown into the presidency after Roosevelt dies, how he really used his knowledge of where to look for something that would precede what he was dealing with, how he used that past to make contemporary decisions.
I remember reading about Truman where he had a council together, and Eisenhower was there when Eisenhower was still active duty, and they were talking about the Dardanelles, and Eisenhower rather almost contemptuously said, well, you know, what is the significance of the Dardanelles? And Truman took the next 40 minutes to explain the history of the Dardanelles from 200 BC to the present. And after he was done, Eisenhower had the courtesy to go up to him and apologize.
I don't doubt that. I don't know that example, but I'm not surprised that that's typically true. What he's also an example of is that, and it's one of the things I've seen here now for years, there's a lot of good history that comes out of academia. There's no doubt about that. But you don't have to be in academia to appreciate history. As a matter of fact, I think it's much more appreciated off the campus, I have to say. Because for a lot of the people there, it's a career. And so what they're even writing about is based on, well, how's this going to advance me in terms of tenure, promotion to full professor, whatever the case may be. Whereas outside among the public, and Truman is a great example of this, he just saw it as absolutely a practical, useful thing. So I'm not surprised to hear that he did that, and he is a great example of how history is just, really just useful in terms of making contemporary decisions. Yes?
I was wondering from each book, what were the 3 big surprises that happened in your research?
Okay, well, one big surprise, I sensed it was going to be there, and I said it at the end of both books, was how regardless of all the changes that were taking place in the county over long periods of time, from formally 1802 when the county was formed on, there's one value that remained unchanged, in my opinion, to this day, and that is the value of individual freedom. It is really a central value here. And it doesn't matter if you were looking at Republicans, Democrats, Independents, it doesn't matter what political label. People really start and stop with the idea that the individual should have as much say in their life as possible. We don't want outsiders telling us what to do. And I don't mean just outsiders politically, people outside of our own lives individually. And I knew that was here, but I didn't realize the extent that it was. And I kept seeing it come up over and over again. And of course, individual freedom is defined differently, but nonetheless, it was a starting point. That was a surprise. The second surprise, I have to say, to an extent, I wasn't completely surprised, but was the Ku Klux Klan. I knew, for example, because I used to tell students this in California, where is the Klan largest outside of the Deep South? And they would say, different states, and I say, you should try your own state, California. California had a lot of Klan members in the 1920s and 30s. It was one county, Riverside County, they elected people to the local legislature there in the 1920s and 30s who were members of the Klan. But I didn't realize, I knew there was some in New York, but I didn't realize the extent of it here, and especially in Genesee County. There were quite a few. And I suspect there were more sympathizers who, for various reasons, never formally joined. The other surprise here was, along with that, on the other side of the political spectrum, when I was looking at the 1932 election, you look at the ballot, there were 5 candidates for president. So yes, you had Franklin Roosevelt for the Democrats, Herbert Hoover for the Republicans. But then you had three candidates who were from far left parties, including Communist Party USA, who actually got some votes here. Now, again, some of the explanation is the dire economic conditions here in 1932. But even with that, you get a communist candidate in Genesee County, New York, who's getting even a handful of votes in 1932, William Foster. So, William Z. Foster. So that really surprised me that they had enough signatures to get on the ballot in 1932. And interestingly enough, by 1936, they were gone from the ballot. I don't know if they ever reappeared.
Could you tell us at the beginning of the theory of communism, was it, terrible, or was it progressive?
Well, that's a question that would require several hours to answer. Okay, but I'll just give you a quick answer. Marx's writings and Engels' writings have little to do with what communism in practice looked like by 1917 in the Soviet Union. To start with, they both said that a revolution is probably not going to happen in Russia because they simply are a country of mostly peasants. They saw the revolution coming in a society that was made up of factories and industrial workers. They expected it to happen, if not Germany, a country like Germany, a heavily industrialized country. And Germany had a lot of communists. And the only reason they really eventually disappeared was because of Nazism. They were simply killed by 1933, one year after another. But even with that aside, they did not expect it in Russia, and they never would. I don't think Marx himself would have survived Lenin's regime. He was too outspoken, and he was too independent in his thinking. So, no, communism in practice, many people called it, even in the 30s, state capitalism. It was basically the Soviet Union was like a big company town. You had to work where the authorities told you to work. You were paid what you were told you were paid. And of course, people had this witty saying. They said, we pretend to work and they pretend to pay us. If they were hauling you off to a gulag, which is another whole side of it. But no, Marx would have never endorsed that as far as I know. All right, the last three chapters in Hidden History. Real quickly, here are the Protestants in Genesee County. I didn't think you could look at this county in any serious way without considering the dominant religious system here, which of course historically is one kind of Protestantism or another. Protestantism manifested itself in a variety of surprising ways. One way that really surprised me, which I wrote about a couple pages worth in that chapter, was the idea of linking phrenology with Christian belief. Phrenology, for those unaware, was the scientific study, as the Victorians termed it, of people's heads, the bumps on your cranium, which could indicate what your nature is like. So there were Protestant ministers here who gave endless sermons in the 19th century about how the bumps on your cranium reveal what your nature is. Do you have an evil nature? Do you have a good nature? Do you have a nature that could be reformed in some way through Christian education? That's shocked me, actually. I had never heard of Christianity and phrenology being linked like this, but it was. There was, of course, other manifestations of Protestantism, some on the more humorous side. There were people who believed the year was 1843, that was the year that Jesus was returning. So in anticipation of that, they sold all their goods and they moved to their roofs or the attics of their home, and they did just that. They waited. And they waited. And nothing happened. After that, the preachers who had said this was going to happen on a specific date were, of course, ostracized. Some were run out of the county. Others called this the Great Disappointment in Genesee County. Again, I think it was 1843. It was 1843 or 4, one of those years. That was another manifestation, along with many others that I looked at, of Protestantism. You can't ignore that here in the county. And I would still say it's still a huge component of the local culture. You don't have to be a churchgoer to see it culturally here, the values. The next chapter I dealt with, I called Hidden Illnesses. This one was really interesting to write, in particular because I didn't know about a lot of the illnesses of a lot of the presidents. So what I did was I chose 5 based on the sources we had here. How were those presidents, well, how was their health represented here locally? And then contrasted that with what we know about the president's health. So for example, President Chester Arthur, who most people have long forgotten, he was constantly lethargic. He had all kinds of lower back pains. And we would have said today he would have been diagnosed with nephritis, with acute kidney disease. And of course, back then, that was fatal. There was no such thing as dialysis or a kidney transplant. And he died shortly after he left the presidency. But yet, if you looked at the newspaper accounts of President Arthur, he was depicted as healthy, robust, always full of energy and ambition and ideas. You have no idea from reading the paper just how ill he was. And there were other presidents like that. Most recently, of course, would have been Ronald Reagan, who was far more ill than we were led to believe. And we increasingly know more and more about that now as the years go on from the 1980s. And his medical records, among other things, former aides who wrote memoirs who talk about just how ill he was with various illnesses, and also an emotional illness. His father was an acute alcoholic, and apparently there was an incident when Ronald Reagan was 11 years old that I came across in one of the biographies recently written, and you look at some of their sources. When he was 11, his father returned home just staggering drunk and fell down on the front lawn, and the mother was frantic. His mother, who did not drink, she always said, "Your father has a weakness," and that's how he explained it away. It was explained away. So she ordered young 11-year-old Ronald to go out to the front lawn and pull his father into the house. It was very early in the morning before anybody woke up and saw him lying out there passed out from drink. And apparently Reagan displayed a lot of the mental attitudes, according to therapists, that come out of this. When he was diagnosed with cancer, he could not admit he had a weakness, because to admit he had a weakness would be analogous to what his mother had said about his father. So he said, no, they found this thing inside of me. Inside of that, there was a cancer, and they removed that. So I didn't really have cancer. And that's how he basically explained it. That's not his exact words, but that's what he basically said. It explains a lot about different decisions he made. It explains a lot about his wife, Nancy, said, as close as we were, there was a part of Ronnie, as she called it in her memoirs, that could never really open up to me. And she believes this started when he grew up in a family in which he was ashamed of his father, and which he had to pull his father off the front lawn, and that was just one of numerous times he was put in that position as a young boy. So those hidden illnesses were interesting to look at in terms of what we're not being told. And I started writing that when President Biden was still president, and we kept hearing all the time about how ill he was, and he really couldn't function. And I was thinking, well, how many other presidents have been like this? And it was amazing. I mean, Woodrow Wilson, I couldn't believe how ill he was. How ill, well, John Kennedy, I didn't write about him, but we know more and more now about how ill he really was. He had been disabled, actually, in World War II. His back was broken. And he was on constant painkillers and other things which affected his judgment. Here he is, President of the United States. Dwight Eisenhower maybe is the greatest example outside of Chester Arthur of someone who was very ill. We were never told how serious his heart disease was, which eventually killed him by 1969 after he left the presidency. But again, you wouldn't know this from looking at local media. These people were all just basically Superman on top of things, no need to worry about their health. Far from true. Then I shifted focus real quick here, the last 2 chapters. The next one was, I looked at, of all things, cookbooks in Genesee County. And I got started with that because I had first discovered in graduate school how much is contained in cookbooks in terms of the society's culture. I wrote an article about something called the New England Kitchen Movement, which was directed towards Italian immigrants in lower Manhattan in the 1890s. And the idea of these very Protestant New England middle-class reformers went down to the immigrant slums, as they would call it, and they wanted to teach these people how to eat more efficiently so they didn't need higher wages, and they would have lower tuberculosis rates and that sort of thing. Well, the Italian mothers in those immigrant communities basically told them to politely take a walk. We're going to eat the way we could afford to eat, and we still want higher wages, and we're still going to try to keep our little apartments as clean as possible to avoid tuberculosis. But the idea was that food has all this significance, politically and otherwise, that goes beyond a meal. And when I looked through cookbooks here in the county, that couldn't have been more true. All kinds of values about success, about ambition, about abundance, all came out in these cookbooks. Status, how you set the table if you want to look more middle class. As a relatively poor farm family, you set the table in certain ways. So in those cookbooks, you'll find intricate diagrams of how the respectable family sets their table, especially if guests are coming over, if you want to make a good impression. There's more going on here than simply consuming food. There's all kinds of things. There's the production of social status in that case, for example. So the cookbooks tell us a lot. And then finally, in the last chapter, once again, I return to the reality of experiences of women in the county, but this time it wasn't middle-class women. It was enslaved women and poor white women, especially women in the county home. And I have to say, when I was reading through that, that was another surprise. I mean, I knew New York had slaves, but I didn't realize how long it had lasted here. And it had lasted until the last slave had died. I think it was 1841. So slavery was an entrenched part here, as it was in other parts of the country. The exception was that because we didn't have large plantations here, we didn't have large gang labor working plantations like you see in a place like Mississippi. We had small farms, but some of the earliest slaves here in the county were actually Southern slaves brought up. There was a planter, William Held from Virginia, who came up here with his overseer, his wife, his children in the 1790s, and he brought his 20-some-odd slaves with him, and it was a horrific account that was written by both Held and his overseer. They didn't intend it to be horrific, but looking at it now, you could see it. The 20 or so slaves, men, women, and children, were tied together by rope, and they walked up here behind the wagon from Virginia. When nighttime came, they were just slept outside. Didn't matter what was going on with the climate. They were not allowed, of course, to have as slaves any kind of weapons, so no guns, obviously, no knives, nothing. So they couldn't even fish. So the only food they had was anything they could gather from the ground. So they would do things like gather acorns and boil water and make acorn soup, that kind of thing. They had a horrific time until they arrived up here, and then they arrived at the land that William Held's family purchased, sight unseen. And that land had not yet been cleared. So these slaves now, after all of that, they had to clear the land to make way to plant, to have a farm. So the slaves that were here, the slaves that tried to escape, were often as viciously treated. And I focus especially on female slaves. And we actually have those lists in the county archives, the owners' names, the towns they lived in, how many slaves they owned. Sometimes, not always, the names of the slaves and their approximate ages. And some are as young as 12, 13, and 14. They try to run away, they're captured, they're whipped, just all the imagery we have of slavery in front of other slaves. One woman who had tried to escape, she was actually a free Negro, as it was called, in Batavia. She was trying to leave Batavia. I don't know what exactly, she probably was an indentured servant, and whoever had control over her did not want her to leave. So she was pulled back into Batavia, she was publicly flogged, and they said you could hear the screams for a mile, that sort of thing. So there was a lot of horrific actions here as well regarding female slavery. The poor white women, on the other hand, didn't have it a whole lot better in the county home. They ended up there for a variety of reasons, and there were some common ones which I cited. Typically, the father had deserted the family, and of course this is the 1830s, so women don't have as many options to support themselves. So they find themselves in great need with children, so they end up in the county poorhouse. Some of them actually gave birth in the county poorhouse in the 1830s and 40s and beyond. Some of them were emancipated black slaves who end up there. They were emancipated, but they had absolutely no way to support themselves. So they ended up on the county dole in the poorhouse. The poor white women, as I said, are there because husbands desert. In some cases, there was domestic violence. It was even so bad then, they just had to leave, and they had nowhere to go, so they go to the county courthouse with their children. And we have stories about whole families who actually were raised in that county courthouse. It's a dreadful story, but it's one nonetheless that's part of Genesee County's history, and it is more hidden than we'd like to believe. We don't necessarily want to look at this. It's not a glorious part of our past, but it's a part nonetheless. So I included it in the book.
I have a two-parter. First of all, was your family interested in history, and did they show you the path? And second of all, I never asked an author, how do you get through the indexes part of your, how do you do that?
I'll answer the second question first. I don't have indexes in these books. One of my disagreements with the first editor was I really didn't want to spend another year doing an index. And they said, you're going to have to, or you're going to have to hire an indexer. We're talking hundreds of dollars, and I hadn't seen any money for any of these books yet, so I can't justify that. Another book I wrote, which has nothing to do with Genesee County, years ago, was about Italian Americans in New York and New Jersey. That book with Peter Lang Press, I did an index for that, but back then I had some help. I could hire students to help me index. And it still took about 6 months to do. It's very laborious. First of all, you have to decide what you want to put in the index, and then secondly, you have to go through the entire manuscript. Once you have a proof that has actual page numbers, so you can put the page numbers in the index, and the whole thing has to go back to the publisher. So it really drags out the whole process. And in my experience, I didn't even know how many people really use the index. I know people do. I've used it, of course. But I just wasn't willing to do that. And luckily, both of these publishers said, fine, we'll just get it out. So we won't. The first answer, I credit my father. He did not go to college. We had 3 units at college. He was a civil servant in New Jersey. He read voraciously. And when he passed away back in 1992, I kept one of the books he was reading, and for him, it's sort of funny for Dad, it was light reading. He was reading a book, and I still have the bookmark where it was. It was a book on the Stalin-Hitler non-aggression pact of 1939. That's not something that most people, not having even had a college history class. So I used to watch documentaries with him, and my grandfather, who didn't finish the 8th grade, was very politically active. He was a sheet metal man in New Jersey, and he read constantly. He used to start his day with newspapers spread out before he went to work, and then after he retired, he still worked part-time. But he would have newspapers spread out. Like, what's the New York Times saying? What's the Daily News saying? What's this paper? What's the Union newspaper saying about whatever issue it was? So I grew up around, certainly mostly on my father's side, with people who thought ideas were important, and that you really couldn't understand things now unless you understand what led up to it. So I was fortunate like that.
How far did Grandpa get in academic?
He got kicked out in the 8th grade.
8th grade because he asked too many questions?
No, because he wanted to beat up the principal. I'll be honest, my grandfather, he was a little bit of an embarrassment to my father, who tried to be very straight-laced. He was a civil servant. He was in the Air Force Reserve and all that. My grandfather, he was a sailor in the Navy in World War I. As far as I know, he had no trouble in the Navy. But he was an anarchist. He literally lost an eye. That's a whole other story. He lost an eye. There was a famous textile strike in Passaic, New Jersey in 1924. And the cops were coming by to break up all the strikers, and they were on horseback wielding billy clubs, and he got banged on the head, and he lost sight in his right eye. So you have to get his twin brother, his brother Pete, to stand in for him. Back then you can do those things. For the physicals, to get hired at whatever factory he was trying to get hired at as a sheepman. So he had this one-eyed sheepman, and God knows what the product was like that came out. Yeah, he was very interesting, and he was funny, but his academic background was minimal.
Did your grandfather and your grandmother stay married, or she said, I'm out of here?
Oh no, my grandfather, that was my father's father. My grandmother died when my father was 10. I have this picture of her. She was in the last months of her life. She had leukemia. She was only 32. And yeah, my father has, again, you have these family letters and stuff. He had these memories of that's another thing, oral history. She was waving to him, and he and his brother, who was 3 years older, Louis, standing outside the hospital window looking at Mom up there. And then she passed away when the war was going on, 1942. You know, I think she would have stayed with my grandfather, because I heard she was pretty much a rebel too. My mother's side was much more conservative. Yeah. For them to be a radical was to be a Democrat.
I don't know if you've ever run into this or you'd be interested in researching this. My mother-in-law would tell the story of her father in World War I, right when it ended. He was in a little village in Italy, and the war's over. And that's where he met his wife, lived there for 2 weeks, shipped back to the U.S., and then they would have the boats that would bring the women over, like the war brides. Have you ever heard of that or run into
yeah,
research?
yeah,
I just find that interesting because he was there for 2 weeks. The men all would meet the villager women. She was like 26 at the time, so I'm like, there's no men left in her village.
Right.
So she's like, what do I got to lose?
There are two ways to answer that. One, a lot of the earliest Italian immigrants, the men came first to establish a stronghold here. And then they may or may not have, that's a whole tragic story, sent for their wives and children. Most did, from what we can see, but there was a minority, a pretty substantial one, that just said, well, I never really liked her anyway. It was an arranged marriage. He met somebody in Cincinnati or something, and he gets married. And then all of a sudden, we have these stories. The wife from the old country with the kids in tow shows up in Cincinnati, and now she meets her husband and his American wife. It's not a good encounter. So you had that, and then the war brides, especially after World War II. There was a lot of bureaucratic complexities. Our soldiers who met, say, a woman in Italy, they got married, but they couldn't bring her here initially because Italy, among other things, had been an enemy country. They couldn't bring German war brides. As a matter of fact, they shouldn't have even been seeing German women initially because that was fraternization with the enemy even after the war was over. It took a while for that to change. But eventually they had to get certificates. Congress actually had to pass an act, I think it was 1947, the War Brides Act, to bring them over. And it took even longer if you met an Asian woman, if you were, say, stationed in Okinawa or Japan after the war in the Pacific. It took even longer for you to get her over here as a wife, but eventually that was eased and you were able to. That wasn't until the early 50s. So, yeah, there's really two answers. Depends on what period you're looking at. I don't know about World War I.
Yeah.
That's
That's what she would tell the story, that they were there and then they would bring them up. They didn't marry them. And they
It
would
probably
bring them
didn't happen very often, at least legally. You have to sneak them in somehow, I'd say from Mexico or Canada, because you had the Immigration Origins Act in 1924, which basically stopped immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. That wasn't repealed until 1965, so it was very difficult if you were from Italy to get into the country during those intervening years because the United States said, no, we have enough. And didn't allow it. Does anybody else have any questions? Well, thank you. This was,
Well, thank you again, Michael, for the wonderful presentation. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Just a quick PSA of upcoming events for April. So April 9th is our next trivia night. We're doing Benjamin Franklin. Friday, April 10th, we have Henry Grayson concert. And April 17th, so 2 Fridays in a row, you can come listen to some good music. We've got Henry Grace on the 10th and Bart Dentino on the 17th at 7 p.m. We have 2 guest speakers. Thursday the 16th, we have Richard Chamberlain talking about his great-great-uncle John Newton Chamberlain, who actually commanded a African-American unit during the Civil War. And then on March 26th, we have Ben Kemp from Grant's Cottage coming to talk about Grant and Twain and their relationship. And then our next Job of a Joe is also the 26th at 9 a.m. We have Frank Clement, who actually has a private brick museum in Orchard Park, who's going to talk about brick making in our area and even talk about some of the local plants in Batavia. And then a couple big things coming up. We have a Murder Mystery Dinner Theater coming up on May 2nd at Batavia Country Club on the alias murders that happened in Lewiston. They actually made a Netflix movie about it. So tickets are $70, but if you go to our website, you can see all the information. And then on Saturday, June 20th, we're partnering with Genesee County Parks to do a stroll along the history trail. We're doing a bunch of military reenactments and things like that, and they'll be doing hikes and stuff. So that's Saturday afternoon in the middle of June, so it should be good. So hopefully we will see you at some of those. Thank you very much.